God only reveals himself to you if you're humble and sincere. That's a claim you hear all the time from Christian apologists. Similar versions are, you didn't find God because you weren't open-minded enough, or he reveals himself to sincere seekers, not arrogant scoffers, or you can't put God to the test. You must open your heart in humility. But where does this idea come from? Certainly not from the Bible, as we'll see. Let's start with the assumptions. When someone says, God only reveals himself to the humble, they're assuming quite a lot. First, that this God exists, of course. Then that he wants a relationship with everyone. And thirdly, that he's simply waiting for people to adopt the right attitude before showing up. But none of that is known. It's just believed. God's existence has not been demonstrated. All we have are conflicting personal experiences and feelings from religious believers. And that matters because in the two analogies I'll start us off with, we're talking about real people. People we can see, hear, touch, interact with. With God, we don't even have that baseline. All we have are claims. Let's test the logic of this apologetic of humility before revelation using two everyday relationships. 1. The teacher-student analogy. Imagine a teacher who refuses to help a struggling student unless that student already has the perfect mindset. Humble, open, eager. I'll only teach the student if they already want to learn in just the right way. That'd be absurd. A good teacher shows up and meets the student where they are, whether they're confused, skeptical, disinterested, maybe even arrogant or hostile. That's where you start from. That's where you meet them. That's the job, to reach your student. But then you first need to make yourself known, show up, build a relationship. So if God is supposed to be better than a teacher, why would this being behave worse? Not only refusing to help, but refusing to even make his existence clear. 2. The parent-child analogy. Imagine a child who's angry, acting out, maybe even in danger because of their attitude. And the parent says, I'm staying away. My child is too arrogant. They need to humble themselves first. No loving parent does that. Parents act because their child is struggling, not when their child finally has the right attitude. So if God's love is greater than a parent's, why would he be less willing to show up? Or at the very least, make it known that he exists. In both cases, the message is clear. Real relationships aren't conditional on humility before contact. So why would a God's revelation be? Why should the burden fall entirely on people to be in the right mood, mindset, or posture before a God reveals his existence? Why do certain believers insist that our internal state must be just right before this God makes contact? Whether you're sincere or not shouldn't matter. Shouldn't a perfect being be more accessible than a good parent or teacher? Especially given the claim that the stakes are eternal, wouldn't it be even more urgent that God reveal himself clearly and publicly, not just to the gentle and receptive, but also to the so-called lost and defiant? A believer might claim, but don't you at least need to be open-minded? Well, being open-minded can help someone change their views, but it's not essential. People change their minds all the time in response to overwhelming evidence, even when they don't want to. Ask any former cult member. Openness may help, but it is not a requirement. And you can be so open-minded that your brain falls out. It's not the same as truth-seeking. Now, a believer might still claim that these are just faulty analogies, and that God operates differently compared to an ideal teacher or parent. But then, surely this modern apologetic claim, that is, that humility is required for revelation, must be a principle that we see clearly reflected in the Bible's internal logic and world-building. But, spoiler alert, we do not. Instead, we find the exact opposite. Let's look at 7 examples. 1. Paul on the road to Damascus in Acts 9. According to the New Testament, Paul, then Saul, is violently persecuting Christians. He's not humble, not seeking. And yet, Jesus is said to have appeared to him in a blinding light and to have directly spoken to Saul. Saul, aka Paul, didn't ask. The story gives us a forced revelation, not a gentle whisper to a humble seeker. First, the revelation, then an attitude change. 2. Jacob stealing the blessing in Genesis 27. In this story, Jacob deceives his blind father Isaac, impersonates his brother Esau, and steals the blessing meant for Esau. He lies and deceives, and still receives God's revelation and God's blessing. God appears to him in a dream. Jacob awakens and says, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it." First, a revelation, then an attitude change. As an interesting aside, in this story you can clearly see the old worldview of ancient Hebrews, where blessings operate on the basis of magic, i.e., independent of the will of a god. Once spoken, a blessing takes on a kind of independent spiritual force, like a spell. It couldn't simply be retracted or redirected, even if it had been given under false pretenses. But if you're a modern believer who sees the Bible as telling one coherent narrative, this creates a theological problem. In that framework, God is supposed to be the one ultimately in control of the blessing and of who receives it. He is the one who gives it power. Yet, in the story, Jacob's deception works. The blessing works. It sticks to him. Through a modern theological lens, this means God appears to reward deceit, which further clashes with the idea that revelation and blessings depend on humility, sincerity, or moral integrity. 3. Balaam and the donkey in Numbers 22. In the fable of Balaam and his speaking donkey, Balaam is a pagan prophet hired by King Balak of Moab to curse the Israelites. Balaam's not humble, not sincere, not seeking Yahweh. Still, God speaks to him repeatedly and even makes his donkey talk. This isn't about openness or humbly seeking before a revelation. It's the opposite again. First, a revelation, then an attitude change. 4. Pharaoh in Exodus. In the epic tale of the Exodus from Egypt, the Pharaoh sees mind-blowing miracle after mind-blowing miracle. Water turning to blood, fire raining from the sky, direct evidence of miracles right in front of him. And the text says God hardens the Pharaoh's heart, deliberately preventing repentance and making the Pharaoh even less humble and more arrogant than he already was, while still providing clear evidence of his existence through blow your socks off miracle after miracle. So the Pharaoh is made more resistant by God himself, but still gets direct evidence of God's existence. Immediate revelations, even with increasingly bad attitude from the Pharaoh. 5. Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 4. In this story, King Nebuchadnezzar, full of pride and arrogance, declares himself supreme and is not a seeker, calling himself contented and prosperous. But God forces dreams upon the king, drives him mad, and then restores his mental health. The king then acknowledges Yahweh as the King of heaven, but not because he was seeking or humble, just through brute force from Yahweh, breaking the king into submission. Say it with me. First a revelation, then an attitude change. 6. Jonah. In the tale of Jonah, God sends Jonah on a mission to preach to Nineveh. But Jonah runs away from God's command, angry, bitter, and uncooperative. Yet God keeps speaking to him. He throws a storm at him, has him swallowed by a fish and survive inside the fish. Even after Jonah complies, he stays bitter and angry. And yet God keeps speaking to him. There's no sincere search, no humility, Just a lot of running away and complaining while God keeps talking to him directly. First, a revelation, and then not an attitude change, but resentful compliance in the case of Jonah. 7. Gideon and the fleece in Judges 6. In the book of Judges, Gideon tests God multiple times. First, God, could you please make the fleece wet and the ground dry, and then now make the fleece dry and the ground wet. And God keeps speaking to him and indulges Gideon in his request for more tests. So, given all 7 of these stories, what's the pattern that we actually see in the Bible? In all of these tales, which literalists believe actually happened, time after time, God has no problem speaking to and being tested by just about anyone, no matter the person's attitude. God shows up whenever he wants, on his own terms, not based on human sincerity or humility. He reveals himself to arrogant people, to insincere people, to enemies, to violent people, to doubters, to liars, to non-believers, to non-seekers. In fact, some of the most dramatic revelations in these stories happen to people who resist him. The idea that quiet humility is a prerequisite for divine revelation is not supported by the Bible. That's a modern invention, a theological excuse to explain God's obvious absence in reality compared to what is happening in these biblical myths. When certain Christians say God only reveals himself to the humble, it's more about shielding the belief system. If someone says, I've never experienced God, the apologetic response is, then you weren't sincere enough. You weren't really open. Thus the belief system is rendered unfalsifiable. God's existence and or nature never has to be put into question. The cognitive dissonance is resolved by saying the fault will always be the non-believers. The Christian belief system is never the problem. God's silence, your pride. God's absence, your attitude. God's hiddenness, your closed-mindedness. But the biblical tales that are supposed to establish this God's character, they paint a completely opposite picture. The idea that God only reveals himself to the humble has no support in the Bible. And in reality, nowadays, we only find the vague contradictory testimonies of religious believers and silence. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, and see you next time.